Okay, so the first thing that you need to be clear about is the topic of loopholes. And when you argue, you make some claim about the world, you provide evidence for the claim, reasons, that's information. And it's the quality, how much and how good your information is, that determines whether you should believe the claim that the argument makes or not. So to determine how well that information supports the claim, you look for loopholes. Loopholes are the means by which you determine how good your information is. Each loophole you find shows a deficiency in that information. So let me and then I'll take the question. So when you argue, you're using information, premises, reasons, it all means the same. And they support, to some extent, the claim that's made. And you want to know how well those reasons, those premises, how well that information supports the claim. So, a loophole is a situation you imagine in which you have the information expressed in the premises, but in which the conclusion fails to hold. What does that mean? Information is power. It rules out possibilities. Before you saw me, it's possible I'm tall, it's possible I'm short. But once you saw me, the possibility that I'm short is ruled out. Information does that. When you argue, you're providing information in the form of premises to support your claim. Can that information rule out all the possibilities compatible with that information, but which defeat the conclusion? That's what loopholes are. They're situations that your premises don't rule out because they don't have enough information to do that. So the more loopholes you find, the more deficiencies there are in those premises, in that information. Now, arguments rarely give you your conclusions with certainty. Rarely. Only valid arguments with true premises deliver the conclusion with certainty. But we don't live in a world where everything comes with certainty. So when you find only one loophole for an argument, although you're not certain that the claim is true, because there's a possibility in the world somewhere under which the conclusion fails to hold, it's still rational to believe the claim. The more loopholes you find, let me wait a couple of minutes, and then I'll take your questions. So the more loopholes you find, the more doubts are raised about the truth of the claim. So if you find several loopholes, that's a disaster for an argument, because it means you have several doubts as to whether the claim is true. Several possibilities the information cannot rule out, the information in the premises cannot rule out, which defeat the conclusion. Now here's the thing. When you imagine a loophole, you don't know, as a matter of fact, whether that's a truth about the world. Similarly, when you imagine a loophole, you imagine a situation in which you have the information expressed in your premises, i.e., in which the premises are true. You don't know, probably, whether the premises are true or false, but you don't have to know whether the premises are true or false in order to determine how well the information expressed in those premises supports the claim. Determining that premises are true is a different task, a different job from determining how well those premises support the claim. Now, in a good argument, you need true premises and good reasoning, i.e., reasoning is just support. The reasoning of an argument is just another way of saying the information in the premises of that argument supports the claim well. Good reasons, good reasoning, good support, enough information to support the claim, all of these phrases pretty much come to the same thing. So that is very, very important. Good arguments need good reasoning and true premises. Why true premises? What does a premise being true give you? It gives you just one thing. It says nothing at all about support and goodness of reasoning. All that the truth of premises tells you is that the information expressed in those premises is the information you have to work with when you argue. If your premises are false, you don't have that information. Jack went to the store. That's a sentence. If it's true, then you have the information that Jack went to the store. If it's false, you don't have that information. You have the information that not Jack went to the store, which you take to mean Jack didn't go to the store. That's different information. So all that the truth of premises tells you is that the information expressed in your sentences, in the sentences in your premises, is the information you have. And you can work with it. That's why you want your arguments, good arguments, to have true premises, because then you know you've got that information. And when you figure out how well it supports the claim, you know that your argument, if it supports the claim well, has good reasoning. But you can determine that it has good reasoning without knowing the premises are true. However, if the premises aren't true, then although the argument has good reasoning, it's not the argument you have. Because if the premises are false, you have a different argument than the one that you are staring at in front of you when you're looking at just the words on the page. So that's important. Okay, now you had a couple of questions.
Yeah. Two questions to be specific. First of all, when you say the premises support the claim, by claim you mean conclusion, correct?
Yeah, claim and conclusion, that's the same thing.
Okay, now I'm going to express something I think everybody is worried here in this room. I think a lot of, well, I just talked to you, but I'm not sure. We're worried about the fact that on the first critical assessment 1, we had a problem with the diagram. You said that the argument was complex.
Okay, we're going to get to complex arguments very, very soon.
Yes.
So, and I will say a lot about that because many of you are having problems with complex arguments. So let's start from the beginning with a simple argument. A simple argument is where you have premises and conclusion. And that's it. Okay, and so on the first, the quiz, the second quiz, the last question, you were given an argument. You were asked to identify the premises, identify the conclusion, and tell whether or not the argument is valid, i.e. no loopholes, or invalid, i.e. has loopholes. Now, just because an argument is invalid doesn't mean the reasoning is bad. By the way, valid and invalid are words that describe the reasoning of the argument. Valid means the reasoning is so good it is impossible to doubt the truth of the conclusion. Invalid means there's a possibility or more than one possibility, that you can doubt the conclusion, i.e. the conclusion is false. So that's a simple argument. Premises and conclusion. But many times, arguments need further arguments. That's to say, you want to argue for the truth of your premises. And when you argue for the truth of your premises, you need premises, other premises, to argue for the truth of those premises. Anyway, when you argue within an argument, you have a complex argument. And the examples, I didn't bring my book, it's in my office, so
I have a book.
anybody have a physical
I
book?
have a book. You want it?
Yeah.
That's a cool
Great.
question.
Let me use an example from the book of a complex argument, rather than make one up on my own. Good, thanks. I should know where this stuff is,
It's chapter 5.
being the author of this book.
Chapter 5.
Is my name on the cover? Yeah, there it is. Okay. Let's look at the complex argument on page 100 of the textbook. And it says, I'll read it out. It says, Carlos does not like mushrooms, so he rarely eats them. However, Maria, his wife, loves mushrooms, and she puts them on everything that she eats. Consequently, they seldom eat the same thing. Now, in that argument, you have two conclusion indicator phrases or words. So, when you see the word so, it tells you that what follows it is a conclusion. And consequently, when you see the word consequently, what follows it is a conclusion. So we have a text with two conclusions. And this is a complex argument. Now, the issue that you need to think about very clearly, especially with first argument to critically evaluate, second argument to critically evaluate, and third argument to critically evaluate, is what is the claim the arguer is making, the overall claim. And we can call that the overall conclusion. That, when you have a complex argument, is the question you need to think about very carefully. And before you start doing anything, read the argument over and over and ask yourself first, what is this arguer trying to claim? And if you look at this text, they seldom eat the same thing, is what the arguer is trying to claim. Carlos rarely eats mushrooms, so he rarely eats them. That couldn't be the overall claim.
Why not?
Because it's too specific. Typically when you argue, you go from the specific to the general, as opposed to the general to the specific. When you go from the general to the specific, typically you have a valid argument. And it's so trivial, it's not worth arguing. All Americans watch television. Jack is an American, therefore Jack watches television. That's a valid argument. You go from the general to the specific. But it's very trivial. However, when you make claims about the world, typically you don't know that the general statement holds, but you know of specific individual cases that they hold. And you try to go from the specific to the general. And that's the way a lot of science proceeds. You have data about the world, and on the basis of this data, you make a general claim. You generalize from the data to a claim. That's usually how arguments work. I'm not saying it's going to be that way for every single one you encounter. It won't be. But that's something that you should have in your mind when you're thinking about your revision for the first argument to critically evaluate. Namely, what's the overall claim? And that piece of advice. Typically, an argument goes from the specific to the general. That's something to keep in mind. So let's now diagram. This is so important. I want to see good diagrams of the argument structure. And the book has, in chapter 5, all the material you need. But if I could write simply and clearly, it would be a lot easier to get through. But that isn't the way I write. So, at any rate, you need to carefully read chapter 5. But now, I'll take that in a minute. But now let me do a diagram of that text. So I'll write the text out on the board. This is from page 100. And I'll show you how to take different pieces of the text and put them together. Because when you figure out the argument structure, it's like a jigsaw puzzle that you're putting together. All the pieces should fit perfectly. And if they don't fit the right way, you know you don't have it right. So Carlos does not like mushrooms. So he rarely eats them. However, Maria, his wife, loves mushrooms. And she puts them on everything she eats. Consequently, they seldom eat the same thing. Okay, so let's look at this. Now, there's two conclusion indicator words and phrases, so and consequently. There's also a premise indicator word, however. Tells you you're looking at a piece of information that you need to make this argument. So the first question is, what's the overall claim the argument makes? Is it they seldom eat the same thing, or Carlos rarely eats mushrooms? If you are concluding they seldom eat the same, if you're saying, I'm using this as a premise, they seldom eat the same thing, to conclude that Carlos rarely eats mushrooms, that's very strange. Very strange. It just doesn't sound right. A lot of times your common sense will tell you what the overall claim is. Where your common sense doesn't help you, then use the rule that typically we argue from the specific to the general. Unless it's a valid argument of the kind, all A are B, X is an A, therefore X is a B. There you go from the general to the specific. Okay, so this he rarely eats them is a claim, a conclusion, and they seldom eat the same thing is a conclusion. And we need a notation for representing these two inferences, these two arguments. If we just went down, or from left to right, or top to bottom, we couldn't represent the structure of this argument. We need two-dimensional diagram to do this, to represent the structure. But it's also important to number the sentences. So call this sentence 1. Carlos does not like mushrooms, so he rarely eats them. Call that 2. Even though those two pieces are the same in the same sentence, we will take that sentence and break it up into 2 pieces. However, Maria, his wife, loves mushrooms, so she puts them in everything she eats. So Maria, his wife, loves mushrooms, puts them in everything she eats. We'll call that 3, and this is 4. They seldom eat the same thing. Okay, now we don't have to write out the sentences when we put the diagram on the board. So if we think that that is a sub-conclusion that we need to arrive at the overall conclusion, and that's a premise for that sub-conclusion, then we have something like this, where arrow means what is above it is a premise, and what's below it is a claim. Now, he rarely eats them, and now this is also another reason for thinking that this is not the overall conclusion. Notice, however, Maria, his wife, loves him and puts him on everything she eats. Notice how well that goes with this sentence. Sentence 3 goes together with sentence 2. If sentence 2 were the overall claim, then you wouldn't need anything else to go with it to do something else, because you'd be finished. So that's another very important reason for thinking sentence number 2 is not the overall claim. It's a sub-conclusion, which you need to arrive at the overall claim. And now, since these go together, you put a line under them. And that's the argument structure. And now we can give names to the pieces in the argument. When you have a premise that you use to conclude something, you call it a basic premise. Two is very, very special. Notice it's a conclusion from the basic premise, 1, and is a premise to the overall conclusion, 4. And these are called non-basic premises. And they are so important. They are the links that connect the components of the argument. This is an argument from 1 to 2. That's an argument. And the argument from 2, 3 to 4 is another argument. And notice two links subargument 1 to subargument 2. Non-basic premises are the connecting links. They link the subarguments in a complex argument. So, look carefully at that diagram and be aware of the non-basic premise role of linking subarguments. If you have n subarguments in a complex argument, you will have n minus 1 non-basic premises linking one subargument to another. There can only be linkages between two subarguments by a non-basic premise. A single non-basic premise can't link more than two subarguments. But every subargument has to be linked to another subargument by a non-basic premise. So did you have a question?
Yeah. Okay. So one of the biggest problems I encountered is that first I tried make sure the sentences follow each other. So 1 after 1 there's 2 after 2 there's 3 after 3 there's 4. But if I structure sentences one after another in such a format, one of the subarguments doesn't make sense. Can I take, let's say, sentence 3 and put it in the place of sentence 1?
Oh yeah, again, remember, when you're doing these arguments, initially you may not do it correctly. You may get it wrong.
Right.
But you may see how to rearrange things. The whole thing is, all of the pieces should fit together. And they do. Think about it. Carlos does not like mushrooms, so he rarely eats them. But his wife puts them on everything she eats. Therefore, they seldom eat the same thing. It's all nicely linked. If you had a different way of linking those sentences, it wouldn't make sense. So imagine you thought that is not the overall claim. This one is. Then you would have to have something like this. And now where are you going to put 3 and 4? Carlos does not like mushrooms. Well, plus 3, his wife rarely eats them. But then, consequently, they seldom eat the same thing. So you would have to have something like this. Well, 1 goes directly to 2. Now what happens to he rarely eats, they seldom eat the same thing? Gets lost. Unless you go 1 plus 3 yields 4 yields 2, and that doesn't make any sense. They seldom eat the same thing, therefore he rarely eats them. At any rate, the important thing to do is use common sense in figuring out what the claim is that the argument makes. Yeah.
Yeah, one more question. So, let's say I have a sentence like Carlos does not eat like mushrooms, so he rarely eats them. It goes well together. But if I separate it and put each part in one subargument and another in the other subargument, the both subarguments just automatically make sense. I separate the sentence, yet it makes subarguments make perfect sense.
Yeah, that's the point. With this it makes sense.
So it has to make sense. It doesn't matter if it's different. It doesn't matter if it's rearranged. It doesn't matter if, after first sentence there's a fourth sentence. After fourth sentence there's a third sentence. It just has to make sense, correct?
Yeah.
Okay,
That's the thing. Again, don't think the structure of the argument is the order of the sentences in the text from left to right. It may not be that way. Sometimes the overall claim is first in the argument.
Right.
Doesn't have to be the last sentence to be the overall claim. Sometimes an overall claim could be in the middle of an argument. That would be very tricky. However, read the argument carefully and then make a conjecture about what the overall claim is. You may have to revise that as you put the pieces together. But the point is, when you put those pieces together into a diagram like that, they should all make sense as they are. And if they don't make sense, that should be to you a warning light. You don't have the structure right.
I was gonna ask, how about the rules of like loopholes?
Loopholes.
Yeah, can you like have a loophole with like sub-argument 1 or 2?
Okay, so
Or
this
that
is
certain rule?
good. So this is the first step in critically assessing an argument. Get the structure of the argument. In this course, we don't worry about whether basic premises are true or false. You would have to know who this guy Carlos is to know he does not like mushrooms. In fact, this is an argument that was made up. There probably doesn't exist such a person named, for this argument. Okay, so once you have the structure, then to determine loopholes for the complex argument, you need to look at each of the 2 sub-arguments and find loopholes for each one. Let me just say a few more things. So the first job you have in determining the goodness of reasoning of the whole argument, which you decompose into the goodness of reasoning for argument 1 and the goodness of reasoning for argument 2, which is very nice. Makes life a lot easier. Makes evaluating arguments a lot easier. So the first thing to do is to look for a loophole. Imagine a situation where Carlos does not like mushrooms, but eats them frequently. Do you have enough information in this phrase, Carlos does not like mushrooms, to knock out any doubts whatsoever that he rarely eats mushrooms? Can you imagine a situation where you do have that information? He does not like mushrooms, but he eats them frequently. Does anyone here have any dislikes of food, but they still eat that food frequently?
Yeah.
If that's all you have.
Workers' cafeteria.
Healthy foods.
Right.
Many of you dislike healthy foods, but you still eat them frequently because you know they're good for your health. So that could be a situation. When you were kids, did you encounter situations where there was something you didn't like, but your parents wanted you to eat it, and they had it on the table every night? And so you ate it frequently.
Yep.
Okay, there's a ton of doubts. If we had a couple of hours, we could run down many different doubts that he rarely eats them. We could describe many different situations, all of which were compatible with simply saying Carlos does not like mushrooms. When you say Carlos does not like mushrooms, do you know who he is? Do you know where he lives? Do you know what he does for a living? Do you know what he's been doing for the last 10 years? You don't know anything about him. Therefore, that sentence has very little information in it, and it's reasonable to expect it can't rule out a ton of possibilities concerning his eating of these things. This argument has terrible reasoning. In fact, you can find dozens of loopholes to that. And so you would expect the reasoning support to be 0.5 midway on the support scale, which leaves you, as you know from quiz 2, maximally ignorant as to the truth of the conclusion. When you flip a coin, premise, I fair flipped a fair coin. Conclusion, it came up heads. You have no more reason to think it came up heads than tails. So you're maximally ignorant because you're at the 0.5. It's 50-50. When you know something 50-50, you're maximally ignorant. If you know it's 60-40, then it's more likely than not it will happen. If you know at 40-60, it's more likely than not that it will not happen. When the weather person says 20% chance of rain, you know it's 80% likely. When the weather person says 80% chance of rain, you know, so when he says 20% chance of rain, you know it's 80% likely it won't rain. Mm-hmm. When he says 80% likely it rain, then 80% likely it will rain. You learn. But when you're halfway, it's 50-50, you're maximally ignorant. So when you find a lot of loopholes, and there's nothing in the structure of the argument to tell you that there'll be more loopholes than there will be situations in which premise and conclusion are true, then you can assume you're at the halfway point on that scale. To know you go down to 0, you would have to have information in the argument about the structure of the argument. And you don't have that with sentences 1 and 2. Here's one example of what I mean. 0% of all Rutgers students will get drunk this weekend. Jack is a Rutgers student. Jack will get drunk this weekend. Support is 0 on the scale, because these information in the premises that tell you. So that information structures the space of possibilities that we need to consider at a theoretical level when we talk about support. We want to look at all the possible situations in which the premises of an argument are true. And among those, determine which are situations in which possibilities in which the conclusion is false, and which are possibilities in which the conclusion is true. I don't say a whole lot about that in the book, because it could involve getting into some complicated issues that we don't really need to know. So this argument has support 0.5. However, there's another sub-argument, and we need to think about loopholes for that. His wife loves mushrooms and puts them on everything she eats, but he rarely eats them. Consequently, they seldom eat the same thing. Now, some of you may think that that's valid. You cannot find a loophole. That's not true. You can find loopholes, but it involves thinking very carefully about what those words mean. Namely, rarely eats. She puts them on everything she eats, so they seldom eat the same thing. what do we mean by same thing? To understand, to think about loopholes for the subargument 2, you have to know what we mean by same thing. And although it's probably strikes everyone in here as a very simple matter, no one loses sleep over same thing. In fact, it's a very interesting phrase. And when something is the same thing as something else in everyday life, it's interesting. It obviously can't mean exact same thing, because no two people can eat the exact same thing, since here are two pieces of paper. This is not the exact same piece of paper as this. They're molecule for molecule different. However, we would say it's the same paper. Same number of lines and everything else. So it's not the exact, this is not the exact same piece of paper as this, but it's the same kind of paper. And that's what we need to think about when we say they seldom eat the same thing. When does she eat the same kind of thing that he eats? I'm not going to go into it, but here's a loophole for that argument, subargument 2. The mushrooms are freeze-dried, crystallized, like salt. She sprinkles mushrooms on her food. He doesn't. Do they eat the same thing? Yes. How many in here have had dinner with somebody else where the other person sprinkled salt on their food and you didn't? Did you eat the same thing? Yeah. You don't count salt as making a difference unless it's a specific situation, like a medical situation. Typically, we don't count salt added to food when you sprinkle it on your food as making a difference as to what you eat. So if person A sprinkles salt on their vegetable and person B doesn't, they still have the same vegetable. It sounds weird. Oh, I didn't have the same vegetable that the person, the other person had. I had asparagus and I sprinkled salt on, and she didn't sprinkle salt on her asparagus, so we didn't eat the same thing. We don't talk like that. Now, although same thing requires you to think very carefully about what you mean, typically you just need to appeal to the way you use it in everyday life. But we usually don't think about these things, so what is obvious becomes invisible to us. And many times when you are evaluating arguments, you will need to make the obvious, which is invisible to you, because it's so obvious you don't need to think about it, you need to make it visible. And that's important. You need to use that to think carefully about whether there are loopholes for sub 2. Now, once you've found the loopholes for sub 1 and sub 2, the way to proceed is just to add them up. If you have a lot of loopholes for sub 1, that infects sub 2. Because the support of a complex argument can be no greater than the support of the sub-argument that has the worst support. So if your sub-argument 1 has support 0.5, the complex argument's support can't get above that. But we're not going to prove that or argue about it in here, because it involves knowing something about probability theory and the axioms that characterize probabilities. Yeah, so you have a question?
Yeah, I had two questions. First of all, you gave an example about Rutgers students. 0% Rutgers students drink, so Jack is a Rutgers student, he doesn't drink. But how do we know the 0% Rutgers student drink?
Oh,
We don't know. Is that
once again, our interest is not in whether that's a true premise. Our interest is just in the reasoning, the support that the premises provide for the claim. So if you say 0% of all Rutgers students do not drink, Jack is a Rutgers student, therefore Jack drinks. How likely is that to be true? You have a 0%, that's 0%.
First, then I have one question in addition to that, because here, consequently, they seldom eat the same thing, right? It says they eat the same thing. By doubting the word same thing, we're doubting the fact that the premise is, the conclusion in this case is true, or the premise.
Yeah.
I'm a little confused by the difference of, you say we can't doubt the truthness of the premise, yet we have to find loopholes. How do we do that? We have to doubt something in the premise in order to come up with a loophole. Loophole is about the
Once
support.
again, when you're imagining a loophole, you don't have to know whether the premise is true or false. All you need to do is imagine a situation in which you have the information expressed in those premises, i.e., a situation in which the premise is true. All that tells you is that there's such a possibility, and it can't be ruled out by the information in the premises. Whether you actually have that information or not is a different matter. So, I don't know that Carlos does not like mushrooms. I don't know this is true. But I don't have to know it's true to think up loopholes. I can just imagine a situation where Carlos likes mushrooms, does not like mushrooms, but he eats them frequently. So imagining loopholes doesn't require you to know for sure the premises are true. And reasoning, however good it is, doesn't make a premise true. You can have valid reasoning, and that will show you nothing whatsoever about the truth of the premises. Knowing how good the reasoning is says nothing whatsoever about whether premises are true or false. So loopholes tell you nothing about goodness of about the truth or falsity of premises. That's very important to know.
Once again, before I ask my second question, double check. So the premises, it doesn't matter if they're true or not. What matters is how well the premises support the conclusion, correct?
Well, no, the premises do matter whether they're true.
Right.
In a good argument, you want true premises and good reasoning.
Right.
But you don't have to know the premises are true to determine how good the reasoning is.
Right. And also
And you don't have to know how good the reasoning is to determine the truth of the premises.
Right.
But you do want your premises to be true. If this is false, you don't have this argument you're looking at. Here's the argument you have if that's false. Carlos likes mushrooms, so he rarely eats them. That's the argument you've got, which is different from what you see on the board.
Right.
That's why you want your premises to be true, to ensure that you actually have that information and not different information. Because if you have different information, then this is not the argument you have. When you have arguments with false premises, you don't have what you're looking at. You have different argument. But we have a hard time seeing that because we're still looking at these words. They don't disappear. But if that sentence is false, you don't have what you're looking at. You have something different.
Thank you. And second question.
Yeah.
So, like I see, we separate this one big argument into two sub-arguments, and in each one we found loopholes. So if I'm discussing support for the first sub-argument, do I link that support to the non-basic premise or to the overall conclusion?
Okay. Here, there's not a lot that we can say in an elementary textbook. We're not going to deal with probabilities. That's to say, we're not going to make specific numerical judgments. We're just going to talk about coarse quantities. A few loopholes, a lot of loopholes, almost no loopholes. And our addition of loopholes will go like this. A few, therefore a little more than a few for the overall. So a few here, therefore a little more than a few for the overall. But we're constrained by some rules. Namely, if we do know fairly accurately the support of any sub-argument in a complex argument, then the overall support of the entire complex argument can be no greater than the support of that sub-argument. And we do know the first sub-argument has support 0.5, meaning the overall argument cannot have support greater than that. What I want to go on to say is take that argument to have support 0.5, the whole argument. There's no more reason to think the claim is true given those premises than that it's false. So we're maximally ignorant as to the truth of the overall claim.
Okay, I'm a little confused now. So let's say you ask, in this case, discuss support, correct? And I say basic premise, let's say, doesn't support the non-basic premise very well because blah blah blah.
Right.
And then I say in the second sub-argument, the second sentence or the third sentence does not support the overall conclusion very well because of blah blah blah, correct?
Well, actually,
Because
for this one, we could say this, these are the two premises in this sub-argument for this claim. These two premises support this claim fairly well. That premise doesn't support this claim very well at all. Therefore, the two basic premises do not support the overall claim very well.
So you double check. It's just important to clarify. Like you said before, in fact, so if we find any number of loopholes in the first sub-argument, and let's say none in the second sub-argument, but because they're connected, the whole thing goes down, correct?
The ship goes down because, remember, when you look at the whole sub-argument, you're looking at just the basic premises and how well they support this claim. But the way to determine is to decompose the argument into sub-arguments and then look at the support of each sub-argument, subject to the constraint that the support of the overall argument via the basic premises can be no greater than the worst support of any sub-argument in the complex argument.
I'm sorry, just double check.
Is that clear?
Yes,
now?
perfectly clear. Just one more question. It's about
Yeah.
the way you're asking things on critical assessment one. You say you discuss both sub-argument and support, correct? Can I say I found this many loopholes in sub-argument one, and for the second sub-argument I just say because sub-argument one had loopholes, it automatically affects sub-argument two.
Yeah, you could do that. You could do that because
Right. I mean, I always
this would. You're right. There are shortcuts. If you found this, there'd be no reason to then go on to sub 2. You could simply say the entire complex argument supported by basic premise 1 and basic premise 3 leaves you maximally
I
ignorant.
mean, I always try to find as many loopholes as possible in sub-argument two, but just as a double-check second support, I can say there are many loopholes in sub-argument one, also loopholes in sub-argument two. But in addition, because sub-argument one has loopholes, it affects sub-argument two. I can say that, right? Just as an additional support for, okay. That's,
So, yeah.
That's support, okay, thank you.
And, let me just say this. So when you have the numbers, 100% of A or B, X is an A, X is a B, this is 100% likely. When you have the numbers 0% of A or B, X is an A, this is 0% likely. Right?
Right.
So, so anyway, I think I said it incorrectly before we were talking about the Rutgers students. 0% of Rutgers students drink. Jack is a Rutgers student. Jack drinks, that has a 0% chance of being true.
Right.
But if you say 100% of Rutgers students drink, Jack is a Rutgers student, Jack drinks, that has a 100% chance of being true. You're certain.
Right, well.
Yeah. So I'm not sure. I think I misstated it earlier. I think I said something stupid, but I just want to clear that up. In case you look at this video and you say, what was he saying?
I think,
Yeah.
Professor, the only weird thing here is that 0% of Rutgers students drink. They all drink, either way. Because
No, if you say 0%.
0% of Rutgers students don't drink, which university are we in? Are we like in a Catholic university? Or?
Right.
That's a false argument.
All right, are there any questions? Anyone have any questions they want to raise? Okay, I'll take hers and then I'll take yours, Dave.
When it comes to reasoning and knowing if it's invalid and valid, can you explain a little bit more in depth to that?
Okay, valid and invalid.
Yeah.
Right. So valid is defined as an argument that is loophole free.
Okay.
That's as good as you can get with your reasoning. The reasoning is so strong, you have enough information to make it impossible to doubt the conclusion.
Okay.
Invalid means one or more loopholes. But if you can find just one loophole, although the reasoning is invalid, it's still good reasoning and you're rational to believe the claim. But if you find a lot of loopholes, even it's not just invalid, you're irrational to believe the claim. So invalid, most people take that to mean bad reasoning. No. Invalid simply tells you there's at least one loophole. But if there are a few loopholes, the reasoning is good. If there are a lot of loopholes, the reasoning is bad.
Okay.
So you can subdivide invalid into invalid but good reasoning and invalid but bad reasoning. So does that clear things up?
Yeah, yes, thank you.
Yeah, David.
Yeah, in quiz 2, question number 5, you talked about, I think, some previous duplicates.
Question 5
Yes.
on which one? On the
Quiz 2?
quiz 2? Which one was
quiz
that?
1. I think it
Spurious
was,
duplicate?
Oh, that
Yes.
was the spurious duplicate.
Yes.
Okay. Here is an argument. Jack jumped out of a plane at 30,000 feet altitude without a parachute. Conclusion, he died when he hit the ground. Here's a loophole. He was attached to a bungee cord 20 feet long, and when he jumped out of the plane, the bungee cord pulled him back in. Okay, suppose someone says, well, here's another loophole. He was attached to a bungee cord 20.01 feet long. And when the plane, and he came back into the plane. And someone said, yeah, here's another one, 20.001 long. These are not different loopholes. You just have one loophole. When you vary in a loophole an inessential feature of it, you don't get a new loophole. You instead have the old loophole, and the new thing is, I call it a spurious duplicate. You duplicated the loophole, but didn't get a new loophole. And so that is what question 5 on quiz 2 is all about. I gave you a real loophole. You create the spurious duplicate. So if I gave you the loophole, he was attached to a bungee cord 20 feet long, the spurious duplicate would be he was attached to a bungee cord 20.1 feet long. Okay? So you need to look at the loophole and figure out, if I vary slightly some feature of it, will I have a brand new loophole or the same loophole? When does varying features in a loophole yield a new loophole, and when doesn't it? There's actually a chapter in the book, a whole chapter on this, chapter 6, which I never assigned, because it's probably the only book in the world that treats this issue. See, this is the only book in the world that has spurious duplicate. Nobody who teaches this course and has written the book has thought about this problem. But in fact, it's a very important problem. Namely, when do you have two different loopholes, and when do you have just one loophole and an inessential variation on it? That's a spurious duplicate. It's a fancy phrase. You can impress your friends when you go out over the weekend and tell them that you are learning about spurious duplicates.
After which they will say, what did you drink this weekend? Because if I come out and start saying such phrases to my friends, they'll think something is wrong with me. So I'll say, well, did you drink something wrong, or
Okay.
party too much?
Okay, so any more questions? Okay, then that's it for tonight.